Dae Kim. I'm a faculty in the Department of Blindness and Low Vision Studies here at Western. I'm the first speaker, but also the moderator for this session. I understand that each presenter should limit their presentations to around 20 minutes, and then field a few questions, 2 or 3 questions after each presentation. But then, if you have some time left over at the end, then we'll have questions on any of the presentations for the session. So with that, as I just mentioned, my name is Dae Kim. I'm from the Department of Blindness and Low Vision Studies. The title of my presentation is actually different from what is outlined in the program, but it's still related to blind pedestrians' access to built environment. So the project is called Blind Pedestrians' Access to Complex Intersections. Now, Janet Barlow, Dave Guth, and Paul Panchilla, and Lee Rodriguez, they were more directly involved in conducting the study, but in their absence, I'll be presenting some of the key findings of the study today. And Kevin Lee in the stats department here at Western also helped us with some of the data analysis. So for those of you who are not familiar with the field of blindness, let me just give you a brief background on the topic of street crossing by blind pedestrians. So in many ways, earlier intersections were more accessible to blind pedestrians. For example, during most of the 20th century, these urban and suburban intersections were small by today's standards, and they had much simpler designs which made it easier for blind pedestrians to negotiate such intersections. For example, the surge of traffic when the signal changed to green or the traffic on the street parallel to the crosswalk served as a reliable indicator for the onset of the walk interval for the blind pedestrians. And also, that traffic usually served as a reliable guide to the direction of travel on the crosswalk. Now, similarly, most of the corners were rectilinear in the past, but they gave way to large turning radii corners, making it difficult for blind pedestrians to locate the street and also align themselves correctly before crossing. So, some of the challenges in accessibility to modern intersections by blind pedestrians include the intersections with wide, multiple lanes, wide streets with medians, presence of channelized turn lanes, and as I just mentioned, large turning radii, blended curves. They all make it somewhat challenging for blind pedestrians to access some of the modern intersections. So there are multiple procedural tasks blind pedestrians need to complete to cross the street. And each of those tasks requires access to specific pieces of information. So they include first detecting the street, then finding the crosswalk location, and then aligning to cross with the correct heading, and then identifying the traffic control. In other words, whether it is an uncontrolled intersection or stop sign controlled or signalized, deciding when to cross, and then maintaining a correct heading while crossing, and finally recognizing the end of the crossing. So we conceptualized development of a database, intersection information database, that could make information about the individual intersections and crosswalks readily available to blind pedestrians, either as part of accessible GPS devices or some type of route planning program or wayfinding device. And our database was not designed to be device specific. So our primary research question was Thus, availability of descriptive information about complex intersections enhance the safety and efficiency of crossing by blind pedestrians. And here are the methods. So we selected 2 intersections in Portland, Oregon, and the 3 crossings at each intersection are indicated by the white arrows on this picture. And we selected those 2 intersections because they included crosswalks with widely varying operational and geometric characteristics, including the number of lanes, whether there's an APS, excessive pedestrian signal or not, whether they had separate ramps or a single diagonal ramp at a given corner, and so on. And this is the picture of the second intersection, and as you can see, those white arrows indicate the 3 crossings that were made at this particular intersection. So 22 totally blind adults participated in our study. They received formal orientation and mobility training in which they learned how to use the long cane, how to cross streets, how to use public transportation, and so on. And they were all experienced travelers who generally feel confident crossing unfamiliar signalized intersections. And our intersection database included the following pieces of information, if applicable. So in the category of intersection shape and size, number of lanes, number of legs, and whether those legs met at a right angle or not, presence or absence of channelized right turn lanes, whether it has a 2-stage crossing, whether there's a median. And in the category of crosswalks and curb ramps, whether there were separate ramps or a single diagonal ramp at a given corner, whether the cross was parallel to the street, and whether there were detectable warning tiles. In the traffic signals and control category, whether the intersection had actuated signal, whether they had split face signalization, whether they were protected or permissive left turns, and whether there was a push button. And with respect to APS, whether the APS had a locator cone, whether it had tactile arrows, and whether the APS had audible beaconing feature. And audible beaconing was emitted, it is typically emitted by the opposite headlamp. And it serves as a beacon, and it helps blind pedestrians avoid veering off the crosswalk while crossing. So here's an example of a actual information provided to the participants. So as a general description of the intersection, it goes Halsey, that's the name of the street, Halsey east-west, 4 lanes, 42nd north-south, 2 lanes, right angle, 4 legs, actuated, split phasing on 42nd, some detectable warnings, push buttons, and APS. South leg 42nd, transit station driveway, buses travel counterclockwise loop. And as for the specific information specific to the crossing, diagonal ramp, detectable warnings, no push button, no APS, 3 lanes, crosswalk ends and sidewalk between Halsey and pavement, a bus turnaround loop. So this is just an example, but this is what the participants actually received as the information about the intersection and crossing. So as for the exact procedure, participants were informed that they will be crossing at 3 of the intersection's crosswalks, starting at random distances between 25 and 50 feet from the crosswalk. The participant's task was to cross as if he was unaccompanied and on his own to an appointment. The relevant general intersection and crossing information was played twice on the Braille note. Braille note is sort of a small portable computer that many blind pedestrians use. It has not only the auditory output, but also Braille display output as well. And participants were allowed to ask for definitions of terms as needed. Participants were asked to take as much time as they wished to find the crosswalk and to cross. And here are some of the performance outcome measures that we used. The first one is whether the participant found an appropriate start location. And second, whether the participant aligned to cross with the correct heading. Whether the participant found and used the pedestrian push button when one was available. And whether they started to cross at an appropriate time, in other words, during the walk interval rather than flashing don't walk or don't walk. Whether they traveled in an appropriate direction, whether they traveled within the crosswalk lines, whether they completed the crossing within the crosswalk lines, and whether they completed crossing before the signal changed to don't walk. And our predictive variables were whether the intersection database information was provided or not, whether APS was present or absent, and whether there were separate ramps or a single diagonal ramp for a given corner. So upon doing some descriptive statistics, we used generalized estimating equation procedure to test our hypothesis in place of traditional regression analysis to accommodate correlated response data. And we used the significance of 0.05 and we used SPSS and ART for our analysis. And now the results. So for the first outcome, performance outcome measure, finding the crosswalk, the predictive variables were database information, that is whether there was information or not, and APS, whether the APS was present or absent. And neither the database information nor the APS had a significant effect on the percentage of successfully finding the correct start location. The second outcome measure was finding the correct, using the correct push button. And the predictive variables were, number one, the database information, and number two, the APS. And it turned out that, as you can see in this graph, the participants were able to use the push button correctly. In other words, use it when it was present and not look for it when it was absent. So the participants were able to use the push button correctly at a higher percentage when the intersection database information was provided than when it was not provided. And the odds ratio was 5.73. In other words, the odds of using the push button correctly was about 5 times higher when the information was provided than when it was not. The APS did not have a significant effect on the outcome. The next performance outcome measure was whether the participant aligned with the correct heading before crossing. The predictive variables were database information and the type of ramp. And it turned out that the type of ramp did have a significant effect on the outcome. As you can see in this graph, the participants were able to align themselves with the correct heading at a higher percentage when there were separate ramps at the corner than when there was a single diagonal ramp. And the odds ratio was 3.29. The next outcome measure was whether the participant initiated the crossing within the crosswalk lines. Predictive variables were database information and type of ramp, and neither of them had a significant effect on the outcome. The next outcome measure was whether the participant initiated the crossing during the walk interval. Predictive variables were APS and information database, and as you can see in this graph, the participants were able to initiate the crossing during the walk interval at a higher percentage when there was the database information than when it was not provided. The odds ratio was 3.16. The next one, outcome measure, is whether the participant completed the crossing within the crosswalk lines rather than veering off the crosswalk. And the predictive variables were APS and database information. And as you can see here, participants were able to complete the crosswalks within the crosswalk lines at a much higher percentage when there was an APS. than when there was no APS. The database information did not have a significant effect on this outcome. Now, this one we examined only purely descriptively, but it turned out that the participants, none of the participants confused the median as the opposite curve when database information was provided, but 29% of them confused the median as the opposite curve when no information about the intersection was provided. So here's the overall discussion. So the primary finding of our study was that the provision of database information helped the participants use the push button, then initiate the crossing during the walk interval, and avoid confusing a median as the opposite curve. And the secondary finding was that the separate ramps helped the blind pedestrians align themselves with the correct heading, and the presence of APS helped them complete the crossing within the crosswalk lines. So some of the practical implications of the study findings is that when an accessibility feature such as APS is present, knowing that such feature is present allowed the participants to use the accessibility features such as the push button and the APS. And then in turn, that allowed them to initiate the crossing without delay. And also, although examined purely descriptively, provision of the intersection information also help the participants avoid confusion when there are unusual features such as a median. However, some of the tasks were not helped by the provision of the intersection information, such as the correct heading, the alignment with the correct heading before crossing, or the completing the crossing within crosswalk length. Those tasks were not helped even when they received the information about the intersection. Rather, they were helped by physical features at the intersection, such as the presence of an APS with the audible beaconing feature helped them complete the crossing within crosswalk lines, and the separate ramps at a given corner as opposed to single diagonal ramp. That physical feature helped the participants align themselves correctly before they started crossing. And this project was supported by the TRCLC grant. Thank you, and if there are any questions, a couple of questions, then I'll fill them, and we'll move on to the next presentation. Yes?
So how did you provide the participant information about the intersection?
We provide it through what's called a Braille note. It's a small portable computer that many blind pedestrians. So it's like a small laptop, but it has not only auditory output, but it also has a display, Braille display as well.
So don't you think the message kind of a bit long? So we have to wait until to listen to this whole information?
So we played them twice to them, but if they were unsure or they wanted us to play it again, then we play them additionally as well. But that is practically feasible. I mean, if you are carrying a device and you display the information about the intersection, but you didn't quite understand it, then you can replay it as many times as you want. So we tried to limit it to the key pieces of information, not to make it too long. But some could argue that it's still too long.